Usually, you can judge how good a build is in Path of Exile by how long the name is. So I present to you the Strength and Intelligence stacking, low-life Energy Blade, Spellblade, cast on crit anything Inquisitor, which surely has a long enough name to be a good build. This was my end-of-league project for Path of Exile 322 Trial of the Ancestors, and as such it has a lot of really interesting and intricate mechanics, so be very careful if you try to put this together for yourself. Get one little thing wrong and the entire build's going to fall apart. There are a few substitutions you can make, and I'll call them out in the gearing section, but aside of that, pay very, very close attention to the key mechanics, and if I'm using something and you don't understand why, refer back to a video, double check in the POB, or feel free to hop into Discord and ask people in the build help channel, as someone's probably going to be able to give you an answer. But this is a spin to win build that is reasonably tanky with between 10 and 11,000 energy shield, can cast almost any spell on crit, and has a ton of top-end min-max potential. The gear I have is really good, but trust me, the sky's the limit. It could be way better if I wanted it to be. Or at the very least, given unlimited currency, it could be way better, since at this point it's turned divines into probably nothing, but maybe a really big upgrade. So to start off with, let's begin by talking about the key mechanics. First up, why Energy Blade? Because Energy Blade gives flat lightning based on your maximum energy shield, and cuts your total maximum energy shield in half. So you're going to get a ton of free damage scaling, but it's going to make you a lot less tanky. Luckily, this build has around 20 to 22,000 energy shield, so we have plenty to spare. And with that massive amount of flat damage, we then use Spellblade to apply all of that to our spells, and further use Battle Mage to double dip, applying it twice. The build's other damage scaling includes the Wrathpith Globe, which then provides a lot of increased spell damage, balancing out the flat, which is why you go for the double flat. Normally, Spellblade would not be something you want to pair with Battle Mage, because you can have absurd amounts of base damage, but if you don't have any way to scale it, then you're still not going to do any damage. The way builds in Path of Exile deal damage is by combining multiple different scaling vectors. And so in this case, the Wrathpith is the much needed balance for that flat damage. But how do you get 20,000 energy shield? Well, that's where the Strength and Intelligence stacking comes in. The build combines Ivory Tower with Shaper's Touch. Shaper's Touch lets you double dip on increases to maximum energy shield via attribute stacking. It also gives you accuracy cap for free, which is pretty darn cool. By being an Inquisitor, you get crit cap for free. And the more life you have from your strength, the more life you have to reserve with Ivory Tower, to then turn into ES, to then turn into damage. In short, by stacking Strength and Intelligence, you scale every aspect of a build's DPS. You even scale the increased spell damage, double dipping on Strength by using both the Wrathpith Globe, and of course, the Iron Will Keystone from the tree. Since this is a low-life Ivory Tower build, you also need to use the Coruscating Elixir with 100% uptime, otherwise you will instantly die to chaos damage. This is achieved by allocating the Traitor Keystone and leaving 2 flask slots open. You'll also need some increased flask charge gain or increased flask duration nodes. But if you want to know more details about that, I have a dedicated video talking about the Traitor that goes over everything that you need to do for permanent flask uptime. And you can always refer to the flask uptime in POB just to make sure you're actually at 100% all the time. Now, remember near the start when I said there are certain things that were subtle, intricate, and very tricky. One of these is mana, because without Sanctuary of Thought via Forbidden Flesh and Forbidden Flame, you'll rapidly run out of mana and be unable to Cyclone or cast anything on crit. And so this somewhat expensive Flesh and Flame set is by far and above the biggest upgrade to your build. Not only does it fix mana, it gives RMR, allowing you to use more auras, and in general is just super efficient, even at the high cost. So if you do not have the money to buy one, I'd either recommend not playing the build or significantly reworking the POB, cross-referencing things on PoE Ninja, and making substitutions so that you can get everything working. Also, you're most likely going to have to drop the Zealotry aura, which is fine, the build certainly doesn't need the damage, but hey, it's Zealotry and dealing more damage is always fun. Last up, normally when cycloning, your movement speed is slowed down. The build wears Stampede to fix this. That means your movement speed can't be increased by something like a Quicksilver Flask, but that also means it can't be decreased by your Cyclone, until you'll progress at a really nice steady pace. On the fast end, it takes about 2 minutes per map, and on the slow end, it's going to take, well, depends on how much content you put in. Because the more content that you do, the more time you're going to take in your map. And so now, let's move on to the skill tree and tattoos, then take some time talking about gear and crafting before moving on to the gameplay. So first up, looking at the skill tree, you'll notice this kind of ridiculous spiral pattern, and clearly that's very inefficient, right? I could just connect here, save 3 points. Why am I not doing that? Well, in fact, I'm coming up here and around and down and around and up here, all the way over to here to enable split personality. These jewels are more effective for each node they are away from the starting point. So the left split personality gives me 82 strength and 82 intelligence, 62 passives away from my class's starting location. This one gives 87 strength and 87 intelligence because it's 66 nodes away. That's also why I have one node open here. It's probably a wash. Ultimately, I'd likely come out just slightly ahead by allocating this, but it also lower things down to the 62, same as the left split personality. So I opted to leave it open and take upgrades elsewhere instead, at least until I hit a higher level. Also, because this is an attribute stacking build, unfortunately there's very limited application for tattoos. You'll see that the tree is very bare. But I do have an honored tattoo of a berserker for Onslaught. This is important because without it, you won't have enough attack speed on your Cyclone to hit the perfect attacks per second to trigger your Awakened cast on crit perfectly on cooldown. Be very careful to not gain additional sources of attack speed beyond what I'm using in the build. This will actually lower your triggers per second and lower your DPS. Unfortunately, the move speed here doesn't do anything, but it looks pretty, so that's cool. In addition to being a ridiculous spiral for a split personality, the pathing's also really efficient at picking up high impact notables and keystones. You get to go through things like Sanctity or Constitution, and you get to pick up Iron Will, so you get a bunch of extra spell damage since this build has over 1,000 strength. You get to go through Unwavering Stance for stun immunity. In theory, you could get Called Arms, but I'm not using any war cries, so no need. Divine Shield for recovery. Next up, you convert Agnostic into the Traitor. You never actually allocate Agnostic, because if you did, well, all of your energy shield would go away, and your energy shield is the entire build. Then you come up to Zealot's Oath, applying life regen to energy shield. Over to Pain Attunement, 30% more spell damage on low life. And if you wanted to spend the money on Journey tattoos, you could convert either Mind Over Matter or Eldritch Battery into something else useful. So for example, because you can't evade anyway, Iron Reflexes would convert any incidental evasion rating into armor. Alternatively, you could get something like Leth Shade, which would give you a significant amount of defenses, or a little bit more leech from Ghost Reaver. Just be careful to avoid things that are bricks, like Perfect Agony, or Elemental Overload, or Eldritch Battery, or Chaos Inoculation. Last up, the Ascendancy. And this is something that I really went back and forth on a lot. Because, on the one hand, Instruments of Virtue and Righteous Providence are 100% locked in. But after that, you have several different options, some of which perform better in different circumstances. So, for example, Inevitable Judgment sets a baseline for your damage, allowing you to completely ignore enemy monster resistances. However, that does also set a ceiling on your damage, where with Dual Curse and Curse scaling, you can actually get more damage by interacting with resistances and lowering them below 0, especially if you're doing things like Scorching and Igniting, both of which this build was capable of. Furthermore, Augury of Penance gives you increased elemental defenses, but having enemies take increased damage via Sanctuary is also quite effective, and you'd have Consecrated Ground while stationary. So I tried a version of a build with Sanctuary, Pious Path, and Dual Curse. And ultimately, it did feel pretty good. However, I finally opted back to Inevitable Judgment when I started fighting Uber bosses, because I realized it's just a lot more consistent. And while the regen was nice, at that point the additional damage mitigation was sometimes the difference between life and death. If you're just mapping though, I actually found that Sanctuary Pious Path felt really, really good, And there were really rares that were tanky enough that I felt I needed Inevitable Judgment. Though the downside there is if you're going dual Curse on Hit, you need to get a Curse on Hit ring and Curse on Hit gloves for it to feel good, which is quite a pain and could be exorbitantly expensive. So ultimately, a couple weeks ago when I was looking at these setups on Piri Ninja, and I said I'd probably go this way, I was half right and half wrong. I was right in terms of a regen from this feeling really, really good, and it being a great feels-good option when mapping. But I was half wrong in that the reason most people go like this is because this build isn't necessarily made just for mapping. You want to kill Uber bosses, and on Uber bosses you absolutely want Inevitable Judgment for reliability. Because otherwise, if you haven't hit the enemy recently, your curses fall off, and all that stuff gets very irritating to deal with. Also, as you're dodging, you don't necessarily stop to generate consecrated ground, so you lose the regen, you lose the increased damage taken, you're not always standing directly on top of the enemy. So in short, there's many complicated factors around picking an ascendancy, and you never know for sure unless you've actually played the build. So, gear and crafting. This is where things get really interesting. First up, your energy blade. This is any melee weapon. No, like actually, any melee weapon at all. Craft it with a hollow fossil so it has an abyssal socket. And you're done. You can put into the abyssal socket anything with life, energy shield, crit multi, and then if you need it, RMR or corrupted blood. But I happen to get both on the eye jewel in my belt, so I didn't need it on my weapon as well. For your helmet, Crown of the Inward Eye, enchanted with energy blades have increased attack speed. That part's mandatory. Optionally, socketed skill gems get a 90% cost and reservation multiplier. If you don't have that, you will have to drop one of the defensive auras. I'm currently running Anomalous Fletch and Stone, Anomalous Defiance Banner, and Discipline in my helmet. All of course with an Anomalous Arrogance. For your shield, any Wrathpith globe is totally fine, but getting one with Fizz taken as fire, cold, or lightning is ideal. Avoid Fizz taken as chaos unless your chaos res is higher than mine. My chaos res isn't negative, but it's not particularly great, and I'm better off just mitigating the Fizz damage as Fizz. And this is where I'm running the rest of my auras, Clarity and Precision. The exact level of these doesn't really matter all that much. You can keep Precision at level 1, or potentially drop it entirely, depending on if you have a Precision mod on your Watcher's Eye. And for Clarity, don't worry about the specific level, but 10 to 15 works pretty well. For Amulet, I'm using an Eyes of a Great Wolf with increased attributes and increased global defenses. Increased attributes is pretty mandatory on Eyes of a Great Wolf. Then you could have increased global defenses, increased attack speed, and go for the 10 attacks per second setup on Cyclone, increased maximum life, or critical strike multiplier. Alternatively, you could just use an Astramentus here. It's definitely a damage loss, but Astramentus does fine, and it's a much more budget-friendly option. For the chest piece, it has to be an Ivory Tower. +1 to level of socketed gems, or increased damage is nice, but far from mandatory. And you could also use something with a Tailoring Orb affix for increased defensive modifiers. That would mean you get either 32 or 34 to maximum energy shield per 100 reserved life. For your gloves, you need Shaper's Touch. To fit all of the auras that I have, I'm using +1 to level of socketed gems. But again, dropping one of the auras, such as Zealotry, would leave a lot more room to put whatever implicit I wanted. However, attack speed would be detrimental and actually lower my trigger rate, so anything that is not attack speed. If you're going with a dual curse setup, then dual curse is what you'd have here, or more accurately, one of your curses and the other would be on your rare ring. Any Shaper's Touch is mandatory to the build. And the last mandatory unique is the Stampede. It counteracts the slowing effect from Cyclone, provides solid baseline movement speed, and allows you to allocate Charisma, opening up the anointment on your neck for more damage. Any corruptions are helpful, but definitely not mandatory. I'm not even using one myself. Now, if you're using Blazing Salvo, you'll also want a Nimbus. This causes the projectiles to return, causing more overlaps and dealing more damage. I happen to get a very nice one with bleeding cannot be inflicted on you, but this is quite expensive. So any old Nimbus will do, and you can absolutely use a rare ring as well. Now, I just happened to purchase this ring, but realistically, you can use the same crafting method that you used for your other rare ring by using either Essence of Spite to put Intelligence on and rolling into Strength, or Essence of Rage to put Strength on and rolling into Intelligence to craft a ring for yourself, which is what I did here. I started with a Fractured Intelligence base, rolled with strength, and I hope to get Chaos Res. Once I hit T1 Chaos Res, I called it good, suffixes can't be changed, craft of a prefixes, ring is done. If you have currency to spare and want even more damage, then you could use a ring with increased intelligence or increased strength as an implicit. However, giving up the Chaos Res does leave your resistances in a somewhat sketchy spot, so beware of chaos damage. One of your slots on the build that's not actually taken up by a unique is the belt, though if you're on a budget it can be. The budget option here is Cyclopean Coil. But you can roll Hunter Stygians or Hunter Elder Stygians with a combination of fundamental and pristine fossils to attempt to get life, increased life, attributes, and strength. A basic belt isn't too hard to make. Something like this that's nearly perfect is quite difficult, but you'll get it eventually, and from my experience, a lot of the failures did sell profitably, so I don't think I lost money throughout my attempts. Also, as a note, I don't think the Hunter Elder thing is actually ideal, I just failed to notice it until after I'd crafted my belt. Now, coming back to the skill tree, I already mentioned the Flesh and Flame. On your Brutal Restraint, you want 3 nodes with increased flask charges gained, or you want a different way to get flask duration, such as on your belt. For the Watcher's Eye, ES on hit with Discipline feels great. Max mana is extra max ES is both defenses and damage, and any third mod that you want for something like Precision or Determination or Discipline. Any of those are fine. You could even go with Zealotry for more damage. The other important and very difficult to craft piece is the Large Cluster Jewel. Now typically, these are quite expensive. I happened to get very lucky on mine. I purchased a cluster with Tier 1 Int, Tier 1 Strength, 35% increased effect, and slammed the plus 12 to maximum energy shield. So instead, I wouldn't try to make one like that. Alternatively, you can just buy them because clusters like this tend to be very cheap and are often cheaper to buy than craft yourself. But clusters like this tend to be very expensive, costing tens, hundreds of divines, or even a mirror if you're unlucky. So I wouldn't advise trying to get something like this, but the starter one really isn't that much worse. And lastly, for rare jewels, look for increased life, increased energy shield, global crit multi with elemental skills, and then crit multi with whatever elemental type skill you happen to be using. Because I'm using Blazing Salvo, it's crit multi with fire skills. But if I was using Eye of Winter, it would be crit multi with cold, and if I was using Arc, it would be crit multi with lightning. Crit multi jewels are absolutely the best way to scale your damage at this point on the build. And of course, if you want to reference anything that I just talked about, you can either use the chapters to look back at a video, or head over to my Discord using the link down below, react to give yourself both the community and notification role, then check in the build link archive, look for cast on crit, energy blade, something like that. I'll have a POB to the build that you can reference. But for now, let's start talking a bit about the gameplay. This is a one-button spin-to-win build, and it absolutely destroys everything that it comes in contact with. However, mapping can still be a little bit stressful, because you have to worry about map modifiers and alter modifiers that do things like reduce your flask charges gained or your flask duration, which can mess with your build. Remember, if your coruscating elixir isn't up 100% of the time, any chaos damage you take will kill you instantly. So you really need to be extra careful to make sure it's 100% up 100% of the time. And unfortunately, there are ghosts that strip all your flask charges, which leads to some very interesting gameplay decisions if the boss or a metamorph gets ghosted. I forget the ghost type, I died to it once or twice, it was annoying, and then I forgot because I got enough damage to one-shot them before they one-shot me. In short though, avoid mods that strip your flask charges either on altars or on your maps. As for the rest of the gameplay, it's pretty much spinning through without too much issue. You won't be the absolute fastest, but you won't be the slowest either. That's kind of the upside and downside of using Stampede to fix your movement speed in place. However, this build is also effective at bossing. It's certainly not the tankiest uber boss killer on the block. There are things, like slams, that you will not be able to take to the face. But you have solid mobility, and you do a lot of damage. And by a lot of damage, I mean I was getting 12-second Uber Exarch kills very reliably. I also completely destroyed Uber Cortex without any issues. So if you're looking for an Uber boss killer that's not quite a glass cannon, but not the biggest tank, this is a great choice. And that's because Blazing Salvo has a ton of overlaps. Doesn't have the best damage multiplier, but when you have this much damage, you don't need the best, and Nimbus effectively doubles your damage. I think if you're going for the absolute maximum damage, Phantasmal Ice Spear is the best, But there's a big downside to Phantasmal Ice Spear, which is then you're playing Ice Spear, and I found that overall, Ice Spear's clear was much worse than Blazing Salvo, so I went with the second best but better quality of life option. Though I guess that's one really nice thing about this build, you can clear your maps with Blazing Salvo or Eye of Winter, hell you could clear your maps with Arc or Firestorm if that's what you prefer, and then swap to Phantasmal Ice Spear for the boss. You'll just need a white socket on your chest because you're definitely going to want Awakened GMP if you're using Phantasmal Ice Spear, and you generally don't want it with most of the other builds. Personally, I think it's really cool the way the different unique items in this build come together. Ivory Tower gives you Energy Shield from life. Shaper's Touch allows you to scale your life and energy shield via attributes. And then, you get to scale your spell damage with Wrathpith Globe off of the same attributes that give you life and the same life that gives you energy shield. There aren't really set bonuses in Path of Exile, but in some ways, Ivory Tower, Wrathpith Globe, and Shaper's Touch form a set with a unique effect. And if you want to know more about how unique items are designed in Path of Exile, then I'll link you to an interview that Riker recently did with GGG's unique item designer that maybe gives you some insight into why this works so well and why it feels naturally a part of Path of Exile even though the game has no set bonuses. With that said, I'm curious, if you played this build, what spell would you cast on crit? Be sure to leave some of those down in the comments below. And of course, if you're looking for something else to watch and considering playing the build for yourself, do be sure to brush up on the trader mechanics, which I talked about in my previous mechanics video. Links to those will be up in the card and down in the description below. Now before I go, a special thanks to my patrons and channel members for the continued support. For as low as $1 a month, you can help make videos just like this one possible. And for $5 a month or more, you could see your name on screen, just like these fine folks here. Link to that is down below. Overall, Trial of the Ancestors has been a really fun league for me. I liked the mechanic, it felt fresh and new. I played some really fun builds, and I think this is about where I'm going to call it a league. So this is my last Path of Exile video, at least for now. But don't worry, we've got a new league coming up in December, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot more to talk about. So until then, thanks for watching, I hope you learned something today about Path of Exile, and I'll see you again sometime soon.